Okay, I think we have close to 100 people here today already. So I would like to introduce myself. I'm Juliana from StartCentral. So StartCentral is A-Star's open innovation platform. So thank you for tuning in today. Today's workshop is actually one of the many support that StartCentral have to provide our fellow A-Star staff as well as members from StartCentral. So to kick things off, I would like to first introduce our guest speaker, Hugh Mason, who is the CEO and co-founder of JFDI. He's also an investor who has invested in many early stage ventures before. So he has seen many different types of pitches and will be able to share a lot more later on today. So he'll be sharing about the science and art behind storytelling and why it's important for your pitches as well as your presentation. So yeah, over to you, Hugh.
Thank you very much. And thank you to A-Star for welcoming me as part of your community. I've come fully branded today. I'm very proud to have been at StartCentral since Sydney Yee first came up with the idea a few years back. In fact, it's been wonderful to see the way that the community's grown. So if you haven't been over lately, please do come visit. There is whiskey normally, but not in these pictures. Okay,
Hugh is proudly wearing our t-shirt and our merchandise.
Yeah,
our
exactly.
Brand ambassador today.
Yeah, and can people have a t-shirt if they want one too, Juliana?
Sure, you can just drop by StartCentral.
Wander around One North promoting us. Yeah, very good. Okay, so what I thought I would do is I thought I would talk for as long as it takes, maybe 45 minutes, an hour, something like that. Please feel free to just go if you need to go. No shame about that. If you want the slides, you're very welcome to a PDF. I've sent that to Juliana, so if that's okay, I'll leave it to you, Juliana, to distribute that. What I'll do is there are about 5 or 6 sections in the presentation, so I'll pause between them, and if people want to ask questions, then they can live on screen, or alternatively, I think we've got a Q&A function, haven't we, Juliana? How does that work?
Yes, so if you have any questions along the presentation today, just feel free to drop it in the Q&A function. Then we will address it along the way at appropriate junctures. If not, there will also be a Q&A session towards the end of the sharing today. Yeah.
Thank you. And while I'm presenting, I don't see the questions popping up, by the way. So forgive me if I don't answer them immediately, but I will try and address them all. And if we can't address them in the session itself, then I'd be very happy to pick up by email afterwards, or just come by for a coffee sometime. Okay, I'll pitch on, shall I? So let's begin here. So I've called this the art and science of storytelling because I wanted to pitch in a bit of chimology about storytelling as well. I'm something that's not in my biography just coming up is that I'm partway through a PhD looking at the way that startup ventures use stories, and in particular what happens when those stories don't work out and a company needs to pivot. How does that work? How do people change direction without crashing and burning? Very happy to talk in more detail about that with anyone who's interested afterwards. Anyway, this is a sort of typical way to introduce yourself, isn't it? I've made this a little bit different by putting some pictures of me, not as I am today, but if you spot me in the pictures here, that was me in 1985. I left home, believe it or not, I was actually only 18 at that time. I think I look older there some ways than I do now. I was a research engineer working at GC Marconi Research. I worked on things like digital radar, ground propagation over the sea, application-specific ICs, that kind of thing. They moved me around between different labs over the course of an apprenticeship. I went on to do a physics degree, but ultimately didn't take the job that Marconi offered me. I joined the BBC instead as a science TV producer, working on a show called Tomorrow's World, which had about 10 million viewers every week for half an hour on 7:30 on Thursdays. We'd explain to the British public what new technology was coming out and how it was going to affect their lives. So I've been on a journey, I suppose, from being a hands-on innovator to someone who tells stories about innovation for a living, and then eventually helping companies tell stories about their own future and backing those stories with my own money and other people's money. Many people here in Singapore know me for JFDI.Asia, the region's first startup accelerator, which I set up in Block 71 with my co-founder Wong Meng Wang in 2012. And I've also done a whole lot of corporate innovation with lots of the multinationals here in Singapore. It was a privilege to teach as an adjunct for a while at the Institute for Engineering Leadership at NUS. There's been a big reorganization there. So I'm still an entrepreneur in residence at NUS Enterprise, but I no longer have those teaching responsibilities. So that gives me time to meet people if you want. Okay, that was one way to introduce myself. It was a chronology. If you look at that kind of classic way of introducing yourself, what it does is it establishes legitimacy, doesn't it? It says, who is this person? Who's this person speaking to me? Why should I listen to them? But it requires quite a lot of mental effort on behalf of the person reading the message. Like if this just comes at you, it's a load of facts. So I was born in the UK. Okay, whoopee-doo. I was, an engineer. Well, why do I care about either? So how does this relate to my life at A-Star? Why do I care? Right? I've rewritten my story this way. I'll just let you have a quick read of it. Now, there is actually a formula behind this, and it's something, if you only remember one thing from today, please try and remember this. A great way to tell any story, your project story, A-Star story, is to say why you do what you do, first of all, and why that might be relevant to the person you're speaking to. Then you can talk about how you do it. And finally, what you actually deliver. Now, that's not the way that most people tell stories. And if you've ever seen a YouTube video by this guy, Simon Sinek, I've put the link here, he makes a fantastic case for why most brands are rather boring and don't stand out, and why most stories don't break through. As I'll try and paraphrase, what he basically says is that most of us are very happy explaining what we do. Some of us can explain how we do it, but very few of us actually explain why we do what we do and why that might be relevant to the people that we're speaking to. And we cut ourselves off from a whole dimension of communication and connection when we do that. We don't give meaning to the people that we're listening to. We just give them a series of facts. If you've ever seen those diagrams that start with sort of, data at the bottom layer, and then information might be organized data, and then meaning comes out of information. So information, data might just be a series of data points. Information might be some kind of table, some structured data, but an insight and meaning is a higher level of understanding. And I think in every communication exchange we have and every story that we tell to the people around us, Maya Angelou's wonderful quotation there says it all. Most of us can't remember all the facts that we're told during a day. We're bombarded. I think I saw some research once that suggested each of us gets about 7,000 messages every day from social media, from adverts on the back of bus tickets, from billboards as we walk down the street. We can't possibly remember all the things that we're told today, but we do remember how those things make us feel. And that's true also in business contexts. We understand, we have a gut instinct, even those of us who are scientists and try to act rationally and take feelings out of decisions. Actually, at the end of the day, when we're asked to make a judgment based on incomplete information, which is always the case in a research and development context, then at the end of the day, it's how we feel about it. That's why we either back it or we don't. Right? So here's what I'm going to cover today. I thought I will put some kind of context around the why I've structured this the way I have, and also some of the things I can't really cover in the time that we've got available. I'd go and talk about two then of the things that I understand A-Star does. So my understanding of A-Star, having worked with the organization for a few years now, I used to be on the advisory board of I2R, by the way, did that for 3 years. So I've got some insight into what A-Star was anyway, 5 years ago. And my understanding is that, the traditional business of A-Star was forming partnerships with other businesses, doing contract research, helping companies move into Singapore from outside and helping local companies to grow. In that sense, from a business point of view, you could say that A-Star provides services, consulting services, research services, things like that. But in the last few years, also, of course, A-Star is about creating new ventures and spinning out things based on its own intellectual property. And that requires a different set of stories. So I have a section on that. And then rather than keeping it all so theoretical, I've tried to give some very specific examples, about several of them, which we can go into in more or less depth, depending on how much time people want. Okay, so to try and make this relevant to you guys, and I recommend, again, with every story that you tell, every time you have to communicate something, the key thing is to understand, who is my audience? Where are they now? And where do I want them to be at the end of this story? preferably ending up with some kind of call to action. What do you want them to actually do as a result of this story? So I took as my starting point here information that Juliana kind of gave me, which is that the vast majority of people on this call are A-star researchers. My understanding is that many of you are PhDs or professional researchers. There are some startups from the A-star community. And my understanding is that you're interested in storytelling. And I was really curious about that. I was worried, I must admit, when Anthony and Juliana asked me to give this presentation. I thought, oh, storytelling. Will people actually connect with that? Because it's quite an abstract idea. But of course, stories are something that are all around us, and they're on everybody's website. So I went to the A-star website earlier today, and I pulled down this from the kind of mission and values section. And you can see that there are these sort of 3 bullet points about what A-star does. The top 2 things, as I say, seem to me mostly about providing services of some kind, either advice or contract research or partnering on projects or something like that. And then the bottom thing is about nurturing startups and creating them, I think, which seemed a little bit different. So I've separated those 2 things out. So to try and establish a common starting point here, I want to step back from what A-star does and to try and relate that to storytelling in a broader sense. So this might be a little bit cheem for the next few minutes, but bear in mind, it will come back to something very practical very soon. Something I found very interesting through my PhD research is a widely understood concept, which hadn't occurred to me as a professional innovator before, which is that there is a profound difference between scientists and innovators. Scientists are fundamentally in the business of explaining how the world works. And the deliverable product that they deliver, of course, is theory. That's what they create, theories about the way the world works. And the goal of scientists is ideally to be able to predict, if I do X, then Y will happen. That's an ideal theory. If you can't do that, at least you could describe how the world is or something like that. But as innovators, entrepreneurs, designers, engineers, we have a different mission. We're interested in how the world works for sure, and we're interested in explanations of it when it can help us. But the fundamental objective for us, and as I understand it, the objective for A-star, is to make things what the academics call artifacts. That might be pieces of software, they might be algorithms, they might be bits of hardware, they might be test kits for a disease, all sorts of things that we actually make. And we do that because we're trying to change the world in some way. So every engineer, every designer, their fundamental mission is not so much to explain the world. It's nice to be able to do that, it's nice to have. But the must-have is that somehow or other you make the world the way you want it to be. I want to cure this disease. I want to detect this biomarker. I want to reduce energy consumption for urban transport in the developing world, whatever it is. We want to change the world. That's what we do. And when we do that, one model of what's happening inside us is that inside each of us, embodied in the things that we create, the software, the hardware, the systems, there are our inner desires. So if my desire is to reduce energy consumption of Singapore HDB owners, for example, that's my desire on the inside. Now, I might want that, but outside, there are all sorts of things like gravity, energy prices, and the attitudes of other HDB owners, which I don't control. So the situation for every designer and entrepreneur is that innovation happens on the boundary between your inner desires about the way you want the world to be and the world outside. And this model of innovation and entrepreneurship is called entrepreneurship as design. It's a relatively new perspective on entrepreneurship, which I find very helpful. It resonates strongly with my 30 years of experience. I put up a book there by a wonderful MIT professor, Herbert Simon, who some of you may have heard of. He was at MIT, and I recommend Sciences of the Artificial. Going back to that diagram of kind of the way we want the world to be and the constraints and opportunities of the world outside, of course, some of those constraints and opportunities of the world outside come from other people. This thing we call reality isn't just a physical thing like chemical elements or bacteria or mountains or whatever. The reality out there is often socially constructed. Now, I won't go into this in great detail, but if you're interested, this guy, Dennis Hebert, gives a fantastic description, in my opinion, of it in about 10 minutes. He talks about the difference between the world that we think we can measure and we control, the thing that we think we're dealing with most of the time as scientists and technologists, and actually most of the world, which is not like that at all. And the model he'd put forward is once relatively widely explored. It suggests that, there are at least 4 different kind of levels of reality out there, outside us, that create opportunities and constraints. there are things that would exist without human beings, as he puts it, with mountains and muskrats. That doesn't need human beings to be around. And then there are physical manifestations of culture, things like hammers, PCs, test kits for COVID-19, highways. These are things that we've created because we have certain desires. Then there are things that don't have a physical manifestation, but people feel are very important, like marriage or money. Right? You can't touch it, you can't smell it, you can't put a voltmeter on it, but it's something that people feel very strongly about. And then there are things which people are normative, they're the way the world should be. People will die for freedom. People will fight for their nation. We're seeing that happen in Ukraine and Russia at the moment. People are putting their lives on their line for something that you cannot see or smell or touch. They're not fighting for the mountains and the muskrats of Ukraine. They're fighting for an idea of Ukraine. So the interesting thing about introducing innovations into the world is that it's not just about the physical reality. It's not just about the stuff where technology normally operates. The vast majority of interaction with the outside world is about interacting with this socially constructed reality. And the further away we get from nature, actually, to be honest, the more people seem to care about it, which is very strange, isn't it? So let me give you an example, practical example of how that counts. On the left-hand side, you see a picture of Alexander Graham Bell trying to promote the telephone in 1876. On the right-hand side, you can see a series of curves for adoption of technologies since the number of years that it's taken for those technologies to reach 100% penetration. If you look at the telephone, it's the purple line over here. And to get to 50% of American households having a telephone took 70 years. 70 years. So if the telephone was invented in 1876, that means it wasn't until after the Second World War that half of American households had a telephone. Now, that seems astonishing, doesn't it, when we all carry mobile phones around in our pockets nowadays? But if you go back, and I'll talk in more detail about this later on in the presentation, one of the things I was fascinated by when I made a film about 30 years ago, where I was looking into the history of technology and why we have the technology we do. In 1876, it wasn't at all obvious that there was a need for a telephone. There was a network of telegraph wires across America, and those were very expensive to put up. And by the 1870s, there was technology to multiplex signals. You could send perhaps 16, 32 Morse code signals down a single wire at the same time. On the other hand, if you use that wire for telephone communication, you could only send one signal down it. And it was a person-to-person connection. Why would you want that? Why would you want something that was so intimate? And if you think about telephones, I don't know if it was the same for your grandparents' generation. My grandparents used to have their telephone in the hallway by the door. That was very normal in Britain, because the telephone was this alien thing. It was like someone coming to the door and ringing the bell. And you'd go and you'd speak into it and you'd give your message. Your dad would encourage you to be as short as possible on the phone, right? And then you go and sit down again. You didn't chat into it, right? It wasn't something, it was a system for conveying short messages, right? That's what you did. So I just want to give that. I'll come back in more detail at the end of the presentation, look at the telephone in more detail and how, if we were today launching a technology like that, what might we do? But I think it does demonstrate that the need for a telephone was not obvious at all. And if you're interested in the film that I made around that, there's a shameless plug for it here. I think you should be able to click on the PDF. So, okay, so the right-hand side shows a book which I found absolutely fascinating. It might be a bit cheemy, as I say, for the rest of you, but it's called The Instruction of Imagination. It's written by an evolutionary linguist called Daniel Dorr. And to summarize the book, basically, he suggests that language evolved in human beings to the way we have it today, primarily as a way for us to tell each other about the ideas we have and to try and influence each other. And he gives a very good example of how human language is different to the kinds of languages that many animals use. Fundamentally, because we have imagination, it doesn't appear that they do. They talk, animals, and do communicate, many of them, about things which are here and now, but they don't communicate about things that they imagine, apparently. Read the research, read the book for the details on that. So the model of communication that he puts up, the context for stories, is this. Someone who's transmitting a story has an internal idea of what they want to share, right? That has to be coded into some kind of message. And that will depend partly on the social context. If you're a 18th century British aristocrat, you're going to encode the message in a different way to a Chinese teenager today, right? Words are going to come out of your mouth. They're conveyed by sound waves. They're listened to, and they're interpreted. They go through another filter. The person listening to you is not the same as you. They have a different view of the world. And eventually they form a view. They feel something based on what you've said. So this bit in the middle is kind of about presentation technique. And I'm not going to talk about that today. We can do another session on that for anyone who's interested. It might be best done face to face. But if you want to talk about presentation technique and the physical presence of communication, we can do that. What I wanted to talk about is the content of messages, how we encode our ideas and our intentions in such a way that we change the opinion of people over here on the other side, how we instruct the imagination of other people. That's what stories are for. And the message of this book, whether you believe it or not, Daniel Doyle writes about storytelling as a technology. He calls it a technology. It's a set of tools in order to influence other people. Okay, so why would you want to influence other people? I looked at, as I say, A-Star's kind of mission statement, and it seemed to me these first two things were both about selling relatively conventional services. You know, it's fairly well understood what contract research might mean. It's fairly well understood if you're trying to license a patent, what that might mean. It's fairly well understood if you're applying with an organization for an innovation grant or something like that, right? You're selling an established proposition. So first of all, in terms of stories, I wanted to look at that kind of conventional situation where we know what we're selling. And often we know what someone else wants to buy. We think we do. So you've all been sold to, I'm sure. You've all had people come and try and sell you stuff in a business context. And every salesman in the world more or less tells the same story. They basically say, you're doing fine. You're a great company. We really want to work with you because we respect what you're doing. But if you added A-Star, things would be fantastic. All right. New, improved A-Star, buy it now. All right. However, when you're sitting on the other side of a desk and someone's selling to you like that, you know that there's kind of a gap between where you are now and actually delivering the benefits that they're promising, right? Sometimes the reality doesn't match up to the promise, especially if you're buying computer software. You know, there's that famous quote from Bill Gates, I think. Somebody said, Bill Gates said to, who is it now? One of the motor manufacturers, if cars had progressed at the same speed as software over the last 30 years, then we'd all be flying to Mars or something. And the car industry responded and said, and if cars were manufactured like software, they'd only deliver for the first sort of 20% of what they promised on the packet. And then you'd have to pay for an upgrade before you got what you were promised. So we all know that there is a difference between promise and delivery. So when we buy in a business context, we tend to buy quite complicated things in a different way, for example, to the way many of us do at home. The way that you construct a story to sell at work might be very different to the way that a story is sold to you about some cosmetics or some clothes or some music or some holiday or something like that. Typically, when you're selling to someone at home, there's only one person involved, or there might be a couple or a family, but it's not that many people. And typically, it's a fairly obvious benefit that it's providing, and it's often a very emotional kind of message. In a business context, you've got many people involved in the decision. You've got a much more sophisticated process of having to justify why that decision is being made, and you need a very different kind of story. In fact, you need several stories. Now, this model comes from a guy called Graham Lind. I've put a link to him in the bottom right-hand corner, and he recorded some YouTube interviews with me when I was running JFDI about 10 years ago, and I thought it was a fantastic model. I've not been able to trace the origins of this. It might be somewhere in the academic literature, so if anyone watching has seen this before, let me know, please. Graham's concept is that through a kind of business sales cycle, there are kind of several stories that you need to hear, and they evolve over time. At the very beginning, you're really figuring out what is it that somebody wants, and the customer is figuring out what do I want, and they're having an internal discussion often about it. And then they're all looking at the options, and then finally, when they've shortlisted it, they make a selection at the end. Yeah. So the problem with dealing with multiple stakeholders inside a company, a corporate partner, which I guess would be the typical situation for A-Star, is you're going to have different opinions, right? Some people may be able to articulate what job they want to be done by working with A-Star or by working with your startup, if you're a startup in this audience today. Most of the time, people aren't very clear about why they're talking to you. They actually don't know what problem they're trying to solve. Or the way they articulate a problem would be in a very technical, narrow way, when really what they're trying to do is to settle a dispute between two business units. You know, it's about a much larger, complicated strategic discussion that the bosses are having or whatever. So the first thing you have to figure out if you're in a business-to-business context is what problem am I actually being asked to solve here, so that I can tell a story which indicates in some way how we might provide a solution to it. Now, I forgot to say that there's a kind of graph element to this graphic up on screen. Time flows from left to right. And on the vertical axis, we've got kind of level of concern. So at the bottom is not very concerned, and at the top is very concerned about it. So initially, people will be conscious that they don't really know what they're asking for, but it's not their biggest worry. Right? And as they go through, they'll start to realize, if we're going to ask for a tender of all this stuff, we actually need to know what we're asking for. Someone's got to write the tender document, right? And you get more and more confident that actually there is a solution out there. It's just a question of which one. So at the very beginning of the process, the thing that people really need, the stories they need, are information. They need to know what's possible. They need to know who the players are in the marketplace. They need just generally information. And that information has to be provided in a way that all the stakeholders inside a partner organization can understand it. Some of those partners might be technical, some of them might be commercial, some of them might be marketing people, there might be all sorts of different people, some of them might be regulatory people, the legal department. They all need information that makes them feel comfortable with playing their role in a sales decision. If they're not comfortable with their role, what will typically happen is they'll just kind of Tai Chi it to the side of the desk, and it will kind of sit there and like they won't make a decision. So often, if you're at the beginning of a process of trying to tell a story to someone, where you're trying to get them to buy something, and it's a business context, if you're not getting any reaction out of them, it might well be because they just don't understand what they need to ask. They're embarrassed about asking what they don't need, what they need to know. And that's one of the reasons why it's very common in a business-to-business context to do things like running seminars or to run online forums where there's a community, like a Stack Exchange type thing, or groups.io, where people share stuff freely, GitHub kind of stuff, where people are sharing information. And you don't have to feel embarrassed then. If your boss has asked you to look, hey, this thing's come in from, this company, what do you think? Is it rubbish or should I look at it? And you have to give an opinion. People will often go to those forums and they'll start using Dr. Google to figure out, what do I need to know? So information is typically the top priority at the beginning of a sales cycle. So the stories need to be about information. And the channels through which those stories provided, typically things like communities, seminars, things like that, unthreatening, neutral environments where someone doesn't feel that they're on the spot being asked to buy something. Now, they're very worried about cost initially because they don't have the information. So they're worried that whatever they need to bring in, this is going to be very expensive. We can't afford this. This is impossible. Well, it's going to be really hard to get this through procurement, all that kind of stuff. Right? As they go through the cycle and they get more information, they get less worried about cost. And eventually, when they come to make a decision, of course, price will be a factor in the decision, but it won't be the only factor. For example, in Europe now, if you're pitching for major government contracts, I think in some tenders up to 20% of the tender score will be how auditable your sustainability energy is inside your organization. Right? Price is only one of many factors. But the thing which tends to dominate anyway, most business decisions, is risk. At the beginning, people know there is risk, but they're not focused on it because they actually don't know what they want. They don't know what options are out there, and they haven't really figured out what problem they're trying to solve. But by the time they get confident with all of those things, most businesses at the end of the day will prioritize minimizing risk above everything else. So, for example, I was mentoring a startup when I was teaching at NUS. It was a startup from within NUS which had developed a new electrode technology for rechargeable cells. And from memory, I think it was some new compound, and it boosted it reduced the charging time by 75% or something. So you could charge batteries much faster. But two issues. First of all, it relied on a compound that was quite rare. And in order to scale up to achieve the sales projections they were making, you'd need something like 250 kilograms of this material every year. And currently there were only about 250 kilograms in the world. So that was a risk. And the second risk was, as we thought through, well, who would actually be involved in the purchase decision for that technology? We thought to ourselves, well, at the end of the day, it's going to be a sort of production director who's going to probably dominate the decision, someone who's being asked to introduce this new compound into their production line. And if everything goes horribly wrong, they're churning out 1 million battery cells every day or something, or 10,000 or whatever. They're going to have to recall all those cells, and the cost of the company is going to be disastrous, and they're going to lose their job. So not surprisingly, that production director is going to be extremely conservative. So if the battery has any kind of risk attached to it, if that technology has any risk attached to it, or there's any sense in which case it might mess up the existing production line, they're probably going to score that lowly as an innovation priority. So presenting innovations or services as de-risks is incredibly important in a business-to-business context. Okay, so that's selling things that people understand and which you understand what you're selling, and where people can go on a journey to understand why they want to buy. Let's talk a little bit more now about new ventures. Now, new ventures are different. They're another core element within A-Star's mission, but new ventures are different because they involve lots of unknowns by definition. Excuse me. You've probably come across this diagram before. It's the classic kind of design thinking diagram that shows that every successful innovation needs to have these 3 elements to it. So when you tell a story, particularly to investors, you need to have all 3 of these satisfied. It's pretty obvious that a technology has got to be feasible. If it's not feasible, it's science fiction, even if it's incredibly desirable and it would make lots of money. It's science fiction. So it's very important that something has high technology readiness in order to be adopted by the market. But 2/3 of what matters is not to do with technology. It's to do with, is there a viable business case around this thing? In other words, can I tell a story about how this is going to create value for somebody? And is it desired by all the stakeholders involved? And when I say stakeholders, we'll come back to talk more specifically about those at the moment. But if you think of something like an electric toothbrush, has something like 200. We did a breakdown once in one of my student classes. If you think of all the people involved, there's the people who make the plastic that covers the power cable that goes to the charger that charges up the electric toothbrush. There's the people that make the nylon that goes into the bristles. There's the people that tested the nylon to show that it's safe to put in someone's mouth. There's obviously the customer who bought the thing. There's a retailer who sells it to you. There's mold and bacteria in the bathroom which might settle on the bristles and make it toxic over time. There are people who made the motor. There's people who extracted the metals for the motor from the ground. So when you map out all the stakeholders involved in something as simple as an electric toothbrush, there's something like 200. If you do the same exercise for a car, you'll find there's about 3,000, 4,000 people often in a typical traditional gasoline or diesel car supply chain. If you do that for a nuclear submarine or something like that, you've probably got 10,000 stakeholders. And whatever innovation is being put forward has got to be desired by all of those stakeholders, because all of those stakeholders can block it. Their stakeholders must be taken into account in the story that you're telling. So one of the key things when you're starting to tell a story about a new venture is to think, who actually are the stakeholders in this thing? So many of you, I think, will be familiar with this concept of technology readiness. That is, will the technology work? Is it feasible? If you're not familiar with it, the concept of technology readiness is that things start off as an observation off in the laboratory of a fundamental phenomenon. For example, you might have some fairly unusual crystal, and you find that when you compress it, it generates an electromotive force across it. So it's got a voltage across it, and it's piezoelectric in some way, right? In order for that piece of material to find its way into a ultrasonic transducer that's scanning a pregnant woman's stomach, that might be a 15-year journey. So to go from technology readiness level 1 to technology readiness level 9 might take, say, 15 years, typically. But in parallel with that, Professor Steve Blank at Stanford put forward a concept that we also need to think about investment readiness. If you think about that blob that's about feasibility, this is about technology readiness. This is about investment readiness. So one of the things you can do with projects that you might be developing at A-Star or in startups is to think, well, where does my project sit on a kind of map of innovation. On this diagram, I've put investment readiness from low to high on the vertical scale and technology readiness from low to high on the horizontal scale. Now, in terms of storytelling, it's very easy when things are not very ready as technologies or not very ready as businesses. You can speculate about them. Anyone can chat about them over a cup of coffee. It's fun, and often the conversations happen between people who share a lot of mental models. So telling stories is relatively easy. It's relatively straightforward. Right? It's quite dangerous when people who know nothing about technology speculate about what something might be possible, how it might work. We end up with hype. We end up with crypto, things like that. Right? On the other hand, it's equally dangerous, it seems to me, if we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars as a society on developing technology white elephants, which are fascinating pieces of technology and beautiful in their design, but which we don't know if anyone wants to buy it or not. That's a very risky thing to do too. Now, once the technology is mature, it's very obvious that the technology works, it's feasible, and it's very obvious that there is a demand for it. Then you're into conventional kind of MBA territory, right? That's the top right-hand corner here. Telling stories there is pretty straightforward. Before I worked in television, I had a brief job as 6 months as a writer for a technology public relations firm. It was kind of interesting to see how limited the number of stories most technology companies tell. There are stories about we've just launched a new product. There's stories about we've just bought a competitor. There's stories about we've just hired someone senior. Sometimes there are disaster stories like we've just realized our product's toxic and we need to recover it, but we're still a great company. And then there are stories about we missed our profits, but we're still great. You shouldn't give up on us shareholders. Right? Or there are stories about here's the fantastic vision we have of the future. But when you look at all the stories that most mature businesses tell, they fall into about 8 or 10 kind of groups. I found even within the 6 months I was doing that job, writing speeches for CEOs and writing sort of 1,500 word pieces for magazines and things, that actually there weren't that many genres of story that mature businesses tell. And a conventional public relations person can do all that for you. The tricky part, I think, is in the middle. Where storytelling is something that we don't normally recognize is actually in the new venture creation process itself. I talked about the way that design innovation happens between people. I might have a vision inside myself, but I have to convince another load of people to join me as a startup or to give me money or to back my technology, right? So I think there's a very interesting, I apologize for this complexity of this diagram, but to me, it's one of the best illustrations of what actually happens in new venture creation. Now, I should preface this before I explain it by saying that this diagram gives the impression of a flow from left to right, right? And there is a large amount of evidence to show that there is no consistent pattern of new venture creation, okay? There is no universal journey from an idea to making $1 billion, right? In fact, there is no universal journey from someone deciding to be an entrepreneur or to launch a new venture through to actually doing it. A much more complicated discussion we can go into for anyone who's interested. But broadly speaking, I think this model helps to sort of look at some of the broad features. And it's in 3 stages. So on the left-hand stage, there's a kind of a juggling around with ideas, noodling around, co-creating stage. Then there's a kind of stage when you move out of ideas and you actually try and create a business and see if it's got legs, to see if it will run. Yeah. And then there's a stage when you're moving from being a startup to being a scale-up. So let's look at those in more detail. So the interesting thing here is that all startups begin as some kind of co-creation, right? They're designed between 3 groups of people, broadly speaking. Most people and most entrepreneurial research throughout history is focused on the entrepreneur or a team of entrepreneurs. But the more actually that academics have looked at entrepreneurship and innovation, the more we realize that entrepreneurs are essential, but they're only part of the picture. If we just look at entrepreneurs, it's a bit like looking at, I don't know, dancing shoes and dancers, right? Dancing shoes are necessary for dancers, but if you analyze dancing shoes in depth, it won't actually explain the whole dance. The same if you came down from Mars and you analyzed Chinese New Year dinner, right? You could incredibly accurately measure the protein and carbohydrate content of everything on the desk, everything on the table, but it wouldn't capture the spirit of a Chinese New Year party with family, right? So the entrepreneur itself is, or a team, is only part of the thing. Typically, entrepreneurs will have relationships with other people, customers, investors, suppliers, partners, contract researchers, they might have relationships with A-Star. All of those people are stakeholders in the business that might develop. And then typically there's another group of people who are not necessarily going to be directly financially involved in a project, but they're people who might be able to give feedback on it. They might be mentors, they might be friends of the entrepreneurial team, they might be mediators, facilitators of communities, something like that. They might be people like Anthony Chong, or you know, and the team at StartCentral, people who create communities so that innovators meet together. The idea is that through knowing people, the idea for a possible new venture kind of comes about over a coffee or a chat or a pitch or whatever. People bounce it off other people and think, does this make sense? Can you see this working? How much would it have to cost in order for it to work? There's feedback comes through, and slowly over time, some kind of pre-business cognition start to emerge about what might be possible as a business. Now, in order to actually turn that into a business, someone's got to take action to marshal together all of the resources required to do it. They've got to raise some money, they've got to hire an office, they've got to come and rent the lab at StartCentral, they've got to prove that the technology works. There's a whole bunch of things they've got to do. So that's the next stage. And typically the thing that people are trying to show from a business point of view in that stage is that they've achieved what we call product market fit. Does anybody actually want this thing? I don't know if you know, but the vast majority of startups that fail because they've made something that people don't want. And to me, that seems incredibly sad, right? People put lots and lots of effort and lots of money into building something, and then ta-da, and nobody cares. So when I see pitches, particularly from deep tech startups or research teams, sometimes in A-Star or the universities I work with, and I see that there's an incredible amount of the sort of the budget that they're applying for attached purely to technical development, I always ask myself, have they put an equal amount of money into understanding, does anybody actually want this? Because if you develop something that people don't want, it's not going to work as a business, even if it's a wonderful piece of technology. Right? So you need to show that there's desirability. You need to show that obviously that it can work, but it's also got to have a business model which can scale up and deliver a profit sustainably. Otherwise, investors are not going to be interested in it. So that's typically the goal of a kind of startup phase. And I don't know if you've ever seen this quote, but the chap I mentioned earlier on, Steve Blank at Stanford. Steve Blank came up with a definition for startups. He said a startup is a temporary organization formed for the sole purpose of trying to identify a scalable, sustainable business model. So a startup is a bit like a toddler. You know, if you think of toddlers, they're not like little adults. Toddlers are like different species, aren't they, of human being. When they grow up, they become teenagers and then they become adults. So the startup phase is a phase, and this is the outcome of it, product market fit, if all goes well. Now, if you've got through that, the story that you'll be able to tell is that out there in the world, you should pay attention to us because we're a potential serious player in this marketplace. If you can achieve legitimacy, there's this word on the slide here, which is incredibly important. It's incredibly important for a business to be legitimate, for people to want to take the risk of doing business with it. If you're in a deep tech environment and you are buying and you're asking, for example, a supplier to create some life science product for you, that supplier has got to believe that it's worth the effort of speculatively creating something new for you, or even spending the time to talk to you. You need to be perceived as legitimate. I think one of the differences between deep technology startups and many of the kind of internet startups that many of us have been familiar with over the last 20 years is that anyone can kind of launch an app with very little effort. You just write the software and put it on, the App Store. That's it. If you want to launch a new diagnostic into the medical system, not only do you have to get the technology right, you have to find someone who's going to manufacture it for you. You have to find someone who's going to quality assure it for you. You have to find someone who's going to pass it through regulation. You have to find someone who's going to distribute it for you. You're dependent on a whole network of people around you. So it's critical that as you tell stories developing a new venture, that you think about, who do I need to bring on board in the network now and into the future? And one of the curious things is that their perceptions of you as a team, your story, may change over time. So for example, when you're at the very earliest stage and you might be applying for some kind of proof of concept grant inside A-Star, your team might be incredibly credible because you're all PhDs. By the time you get to this stage, if it's all PhDs on the management team, most investors are going to say, where's the commercial experience here? I get that these guys are very smart and they understand the technology, but where's someone who's actually built a business and done this before? I'm not funding a science experiment here, I'm funding a business. So curiously, what legitimacy is changes over time, and the research shows that quite significantly. So the story that you tell about yourself needs to evolve. Let me show how that works in practice. So we had a startup that went through JFDI, the startup accelerator I worked on. It was called Silent 8. And their concept was, if you go into many large enterprises, there's often pockets of data sitting around in like legacy SQL databases, sitting around in email, finding stuff, the kind of corporate knowledge that's out there is very, very difficult. It's buried in lots of different silos. So they thought, well, let's create a kind of Google type thing that we can sell to corporations so they can mine their kind of data. And for $20 per employee every year, they can have this thing. And, you know, and they launched it and people thought, this is okay. Meh, it's okay. Where they really hit gold is when they constricted their story. They didn't change what they did, but they just focused around it one particular use case, which was the know your customer use case. So if any of you signed up for a bank or insurance or gone to see a lawyer recently, you'll know that the first thing you have to do is to show some ID and prove who you are. Now, for financial institutions doing business, particularly online, that's an incredibly expensive, slow process that used to take up to 3 hours per person. Now, Silent 8 uses AI to do that, and in less than 30 seconds, it will give a credibility score to somebody, and it will throw up the edge cases where you're not sure if this person is legitimate or not. And that business is now well on the way to becoming a unicorn, a billion-dollar business. Closer to home, I don't know if any of you recognize the guys on the left. I used to work with GL Tan and the rest of the team there when I was at I2R on the advisory board. When GL left A-Star, some of the researchers came with him and they set up an AI startup called Ada. And for the first few years, I used to meet GL for a drink every so often. And I say, GL, you've got to focus around here. This is a great business that you've got, but you're trying to do various different applications of AI. You're trying to be an AI shop that will help detect fraud in banks, that will help to do blah, 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 blah. And the use case they focused on eventually was processing insurance claims, I think, for health insurance and detecting fraud there. And by telling a very focused single story about the place they could make the biggest impact, that's why they became such a valuable business that in January this year, they were bought by Amplify Health. So that's really a change, that their story has evolved. The people have stayed the same, the technology has more or less stayed the same, but it was the story which had to mature in order for that to become a valuable enough business to be bought. So how do you actually do all of that? In particular, if you think of there being two ways of doing innovation for a new venture, you can either take a technology to market, which is the way that traditionally people often thought about technology. You know, they think of Bell Labs sort of, you know, inventing things and taking them to the market. The trouble with that is it's a very, very expensive, long process. You need to have the kind of monopoly on a telco that the size of a continent that Bell Labs had in order to do that. And the reason why is because in order to take a technology to market, you need to go through quite a complex process. And I'm going to go through that briefly now for the telephone, because it's a technology that we're all familiar with, because I think you could apply the same thinking to a life sciences product. You could apply it to some interesting new development that's come out of the lab. It's quite a universal kind of process. So if you were selling the telephone today, first thing you could do is to write down the physical features of the telephone. You know, and here are some. You know, obviously it transmits sounds. It's got this feature of it that is very direct and intimate. You know, there are all these different things, right? These are things that make it different from a telegraph, a Morse code telegraph, which was the, you know, established technology at the time. Now, the next bit is what I call the Fourier transform of innovation. For anyone who's from an engineering background will know that you can look at a signal like a square wave on an oscilloscope, and you can look at it in the time domain, voltage against time, or you can look at it in the frequency domain. You can say what frequencies are present in order to create that shape of wave. And they're both equally valid representations of the signal. In the same way, I think when you're trying to do innovation, the thing that we all focus on, especially if we're technical researchers, as I once was, we focus on the physical features. That's what's in front of us in the lab. So that's the obvious thing to focus on. But the first step in trying to actually tell a story about a technology is to stop thinking about features and instead to start thinking about benefits. What do those features make possible? So if you can transmit sound, you could send speech, obviously, or music, or, there are all these different things you could do with it. If you can have private conversations, you can do all these sorts of things. Now, in fact, Bell and people around him in 1876 went through something like a very similar process when they were thinking about the telephone. It's interesting to see now, but one of the first applications that was proposed for the telephone, in fact, was set up, I think, in a Czech city, was what we would now think of as radio. They thought the telephone would be a great way to listen to kind of live opera performances and things like that at home, right? Seems extraordinary, but that's the very first thing, one of the first things they looked at for the telephone. If you think about the benefits, the next thing to do would be to think about, well, okay, in what situation would that benefit be really significant? So what use case would that benefit be useful? So use case is when I might have a chat with a friend. That's when I would need to convey speech. It isn't really about conveying music in that situation, but I am trying to do all these different things. Yeah. So these are use cases of when I might want that benefit. The next stage then is to say, well, in what context might that use case emerge? So, for example, if I'm having family and friends chats, I'm not going to do that in an office or a factory or the military. I'm only going to do that in a domestic context. On the other hand, if I'm coordinating a business, then that's going to happen in an office or a factory, or communicating or coordinating an army or something like, or a logistics network, like a railway network, something like that. And actually, for a railway network, it'd be super helpful to have accurate time without needing special technology to interpret. I could just ask someone the time, right? So next, if we look at all of those possible markets and we say, well, how big is this market? How profitable could it be? Is it easy to reach customers there? Do they have an urgent need for it? Do they need to buy it today? Or can they solve that some other way? Would it be quick to roll this technology out? Then you see that the highest scoring of those is probably the office context. Yeah, that's probably the environment in which it would be easiest, where would be the lowest hanging fruit to launch the telephone. And I believe that is where the telephone was first launched, although it was used for communication between business premises, like between a storeroom, a store warehouse, and an office where people were placing orders. And it was used by the military, field telephones, and it was definitely used on transport networks. But it wasn't initially used in domestic context. And it certainly wasn't really used for broadcasting sound. That came later. That was 30 years later. That was radio. So how does all that kind of thinking relate to this kind of a real world business? I'm going to give you a couple more examples. This was a startup that came through JFDI and was the first to exit from us, a very valuable business. Initially, the guys who put up TradeGecko faced a practical problem. They were running a t-shirt business in New Zealand, creating designer t-shirts, and they found that when their salespeople went to visit customers, that the customers would order, they'd like the t-shirts, they'd order loads of stuff, but they'd hand fax in orders or send in emails in text and stuff like that. All the orders came in higgledy-piggledy, and half the time people would order the wrong unit, the thing would turn up, they'd have to replace it. And the company they were actually running, the t-shirt business, actually had great t-shirts, but it went bust, not because it had a bad product, but because it couldn't figure out how to distribute to multiple retail channels. So the initial thought the founders had was, I wonder if there are lots of people trying to sell to small retailers like that. If we could create some iPad-based thing, the iPad had just come out this year, which would allow salespeople to show a retail shop owner, here are the things in stock, which of these do you want? And then you click on and they would do a visual ordering right there and then they would have clear orders. So anyway, we liked these team. We thought their idea may or may not be okay. We didn't have enough data to make a choice on it, but they joined our startup accelerator. And what impressed us most about the guys behind this team was that they spent the first 2 weeks on our program, getting up at 4 a.m, and every day they would make something like 100 phone calls, trying to get through to people running small businesses to try and understand, would this kind of sales technology be useful? And what they discovered is that story was not resonant. When they got through to sales managers for every kind of sector that they looked at, they found that most sales managers thought that they'd already given their sales staff enough technology, that the sales staff were lazy and weren't using the technology, right? And that adding more technology would just create more problems. However, one time they got through to the finance director of a business, and that way, through that conversation, a completely different story emerged. The finance director said to them, so what you guys are telling me is you have a technology that means if one of my customers orders something and it's not in stock, then I know immediately I can manage my inventory. And they said, well, yes, you could do that. Actually, yes. And they realized that this problem of managing inventory, managing stuff that companies had manufactured and got in the storeroom was actually an enormous challenge. And that's what the business launched with. And that's what created a 100 million plus valuable business. In the end, they ended up putting in the feature that they'd first thought of, visual ordering, but that just became a feature. So 2 or 3 years down the line, the story that they ended up running with was, you're a small business that makes specialist things, electric guitars, drill bits for oil rigs, fancy bicycles, medical devices, whatever it is that you sell. You manufacture those things and they're all stored in warehouses, and you're trying to manage distribution around the world, and it's really hard to manage distribution. We can solve that problem for you. So a different story emerged through a process that we often call pivoting in the startup world. They didn't fundamentally change the business. It's still an iPad, it's still an iPad-based thing, a screen-based thing, but it pivoted to a different story. Now, I'm coming towards the end of this presentation now, and I just wanted to sort of summarize by saying that as a business, a new venture matures, I think there are probably 4 different groups of stakeholders that you have to address. The obvious one is customers. If you're not making something that people want, if you're not telling customers why there is a benefit to them in buying the product, not what the product is, but why the product is relevant to them. If you're not telling them why the product is relevant, then obviously they're not going to buy. And that also applies to people like distribution partners. So if you are an A-star business that's trying to create in DXD Hub, creating a new diagnostic, you need to find distributors who are going to also get a benefit from this product, right? Now, as you grow, you're going to need to attract talent as well. And you're going to need to attract different kinds of talent. Initially, your company might be all technical people, but over time, you need to tell a story to other kinds of people, salespeople, marketing people, people that need to be told they're part of something exciting. Why it matters to them will be very different to why it matters to customers. And of course, to investors want to hear that there is profit potential in this thing. There's a very large market, that there is, you're in control of the processes involved, the technology works, you're making progress. And even though there's development work to be done, you're keeping your promises. Those are the kinds of things that investors want to hear. But there's a 4th group. If you're doing something that involves genetically modified organisms, then the public's going to be concerned. Is this thing going to create frankenfoods, the kinds of stuff that we've, or nanotechnology, gray goo, is it going to come and take over my kids and take over the world or something, So regulators and the public and the media also need addressing. So these are all stakeholder groups. Now, one of the things I think is very tough, often I find, for technical folk who are making the transition into creating new ventures, is realizing that the storytelling that they've learned, perhaps in an academic background or purely in a technical context, might be quite different for those different markets. They feel that if you tell a story which is a story that an investor might want to hear, an aspirational story which involves lots of uncertainty but has plausible truths for the future. I can remember talking recently with a researcher who felt deeply uncomfortable about the artificial meat company he was part of. I won't mention which one here in Singapore, but he felt that the company was being fraudulent in the claims it was making to its investors. I put it to him that actually the investors are going to discount everything that a startup with an artificial meat company is going to say anyway, right? They're going to discount it by a huge amount because they know that people are being enthusiastic and hyping it. And also they're grown-ups. They're entitled to make, their own judgment. So not to be worried that the level of auditability of the data was not the kind of thing that you would expect to present at a scientific conference. So what I'm going to suggest is that actually, as you develop stories for a project or a group in A-Star or a startup, the story is not one thing. The story is more like a box with different faces that face in different directions, and they've all got different purposes. So, you know, here's one of these boxes, and here it is folded flat. I think that's the base of the box down there, if you can see my cursor, right? Here, there's a side of a box, and this doesn't actually function as a box. It just holds the box together. It takes all of these pieces to make a complete box, and the box presents different sizes, different sides to people. None of them is the whole truth. None of them is a lie. They're all just different stories for different audiences. So again, I think one of the things that can be quite unsettling if you come from a technical background is hearing a story that's not designed for you. Now, clearly it can't include falsehoods, but you shouldn't hold it, the storyteller, to account at the same level of detail. If someone is explaining to a 10-year-old visiting your company what your business does, it isn't necessary for them to understand at postgraduate level what monoclonal antibodies are. It's just necessary to know that this thing is going to fix mum's disease. Right? So a story can be told in different ways for different audiences. To give you a sense of that, I wanted to give you a very concrete example. This is a business that my brother-in-law runs, actually. He's normally based in Thailand and Portugal. His business, as you can see, has a mission to decarbonize resource recovery for all. So it takes gunky waste from industrial plants and commercial premises, and it uses a bunch of algae on the roof and sunlight to turn it into not just clean water, but actually to recover valuable things like nutrients for agriculture and stuff out of it, right? Now, he was coming to Singapore. In fact, he's here this week. And he said to me, will you take a look over this presentation for me? And I said, well, there's nothing wrong with your presentation, but it's a bit like the way I first wrote my chronology CV at the beginning of this presentation. It just describes the facts of what they do. Someone looking at this has got to say, well, okay, that's a deck. Okay, I see it's this kind. Why should I care? So that's the immediate question that comes to mind when you look at this thing. You think, well, why should I bother? I've got a busy day. Why should I see that? So I worked with him and I reworded it. We didn't just change the font. That was him changing the font. And I said to him, why might this be important for Singapore? And the kinds of, he wanted to talk to PUB. He wanted to talk to EDB. He wants to talk to A-Star because he's looking for a research partner. And in fact, thanks to Anthony, he is talking to some partners on that in the next week. And I said, I think what would be important is, first of all, this is a commercial ready, IP rich, right? So that fits Singapore's mission. We don't want to talk to things which are just pie in the sky. We have enough pie in the sky ideas of our own, right? If something's going to come to Singapore, we want it to be commercially ready. The fact that it's an IP rich business, it's deep technology, it's the kind of thing strategically that the government is telling us we should be doing, right? So that's immediately a reason why I should take that. It's a European company coming to Singapore and it wants local partners. It's not trying to sell something to local people. It's trying to find partners, right, who are going to share in the benefits of this thing. It's going to set up its Southeast Asia headquarters here. And the idea is that Singapore, because of its great track record, is going to be positioned as a leader demonstrating these things which fit everyone's agenda. So in that very first page, I mean, I won't go through the whole presentation for you unless it's relevant to your work and you're interested, but in that first page, I tried to take away all the reasons that someone might say no and not meet with him. And actually, the deck has been very successful. Out of, I think, 10 people that we wrote to saying, will you meet with this guy? I think he's got meetings with about 9 of them. And the other one just hasn't come back. They haven't said no, they just haven't come back. So I'm coming to the end. You'll be glad to hear. So have a look at my watch and see, just over an hour. If you only remember one thing from this presentation, please remember that you need to start every story you tell with why does it matter? Why does it matter to the storyteller, the listener? Then explain how you're going to deliver the benefit you've just articulated. And finally, only finally, say what it is that you're offering, right? Try and make things relevant and try and remember that there is an emotional component even to selling a deeply technology heavy product, because someone's taking a risk when they buy it. So how confident you make them feel, how legitimate you are, is at least as important, probably more important than the technology. So that's only one thing to remember that. I've left you a framework there. So if you want to have a go with this with your team after the presentation, we can even have a go during the Q&A if someone's very brave and wants to try doing it live. You might have a go at trying to pitch your project, your business, your team, your organization in this way. And I'll give you a hint before you start. It's harder than it looks. It's much, much, much harder than it looks. Finally, I wanted to share with you some books that I found really interesting. I'll just go over them very briefly. For the folk on this call who are kind of from hard technology, you know, electronics and stuff like this IET book I think is very good. It's written from an engineer's point of view to try and understand those weird marketing people, right? And it's very accessible. This is written for life scientists. I think it's fantastic. It's about, you know, often life science is deeply, deeply complicated, and the number of stakeholders you have to bring on board, from investors through regulators and politicians, all sorts of people, right? In order to make a story compelling, there's a fantastic, it's the only book in the world I know that does this. This sets it out very, very clearly. Crossing the Chasm is a classic if you haven't heard of it before, but Geoffrey Moore came up with this book, I think, 20 years ago. It's about the adoption cycle for technologies. You can see this diagram on the front here. This represents time from left to right, and this represents fractions of a market under this sort of normal curve. So initially, the people who are always going to buy into every innovation are going to be deep enthusiasts. Then you've got a group that we call the early adopters. But between the early adopters and the mass market, there is a chasm. And overcoming that chasm is often a challenge. So, for example, if you've got a new diagnostic kit, again here in Singapore, you're always going to find someone who's got a rare disease, or someone who's just desperate to try this out, or some doctor that loves trying out new things and whatever. Then there's going to be a group of people who are going to see the benefits straight away. But in order to get this adopted by insurance companies and to get it actually part of ordinary practice, that's a huge uphill battle, and there is a gap to do that. Now, these guys on the right-hand side here actually argue that there's several gaps. I won't go into their model, but they've researched a very large number of deep technology innovations, and they've identified several features of businesses which either cause them to make that transition or not. And a key tool to go down that whole process is telling the right story. So I'll move it over to Q&A now and just say thank you very much from me for listening. I really appreciate that. I can see at the top of my screen that I've got some chat here, and under Q&A, there are no questions at all, which either means that everybody's left because I was really dull. No, there's 101 people still on the call. My goodness, thank you for sticking with it. Do you want to pose some questions? It is possible, Divakar. Yes, absolutely. Juliana has the deck and we'll distribute it. I might even be able to, I don't think I can post it in the chat here, can I? No, or can I? Maybe I can post the thing. Yeah, I can.
Yeah, I think you can. Yeah.
I can actually put it in the, there you are. It's in the chat now, so you can download that direct if you want. Hot off the press, straight from the horse's mouth. There you go.
Are there any questions? Since we still have some time left.
Thank you very much, Divakar, and I'm glad it was helpful. If anyone, if anyone wants to have a go at pitching their technology, then let me know. You're happy to email me. I think my contact details are all in the QR code, or they're all on the slides as well. So if you want to pitch me something, very happy to kind of give you an instant, I don't get this, or I get this. This is what leaps out at me. It will come from the perspective, obviously, of someone who's an entrepreneur and somebody who has invested in businesses. It won't be the kind of, I'm not the customer for your business, chances are, but I can certainly give you some feedback on the story.
Yes, Hugh, we have one question. So from Dylan, for deep tech features, how do you balance how much technical detail to go into to convince an investor? Yeah, I think this is a very common question.
Yeah, super. It is a great question. And I think it all depends on who's in your audience. There really, often I think there's that situation where it can be quite complex. Technical people on a customer side or a partner side often see themselves as a kind of gatekeeper. Like, I'm employed by this company because I have a PhD and I actually understand this technology. The rest of you are just money people. I'm actually the smart person in the room. It's a very typical kind of attitude of someone on the other side. So sometimes you can find yourself in a meeting where there'll be kind of like 3 people sitting opposite you, and you pitch the idea, and the kind of businessy one is kind of looking engaged because you told a great story about all the benefits and how it could be great for their company, everything else. And the technical one is going, I need to look good in front of my boss here, so I need to actually try and trip this person up. Yeah. and they'll try to throw it. So what about this? What about this? Right. And so without making them lose face, you have to somehow answer those questions. So what I typically do, what I typically recommend is to tell a very clear, straightforward story simply in about 5, maximum 7 minutes, and then have loads of bonus slides for all of the obvious technical stuff that people are going to ask. And don't, by the way, I think one of the mistakes people often make when they're pitching ideas is to try and answer every question. Now, if you pitch a clear story about your innovation, and then the people the other side of the table ask a question, they feel really smart, right? Because I asked this question, it was really, really good. And then you have a slide and you answer it and you said, that's a really great question. Wow. Funnily enough, I prepared this graph earlier and it shows that there's nothing to worry about. And then, so now the smarty pants technical person on the other side of the table, they look smart in front of their boss because they asked a good question. You've provided the answer, which means they can't crap on your idea. And you've given them face by kind of acknowledging what a profound question it was to ask and how absolutely appropriate it was, and how this has been asked actually by several other people. And thanks so much for that great question. So I think my suggestion is tell the story and then let technical people on the other side ask questions which they think are important, because that way they feel they look good by asking the right question. And I can just see here that Sundara has asked, Hugh, is there any standard process to do product market fit analysis? Well, there are several methods. I think if you did the sort of Stanford biodesign thing, that's one approach. Another approach that's often worked in the startup world is, as software startups, is this lean startup. There's another methodology called design thinking. There is a slide that I've got somewhere which shows the relationship of those three things, but I think rather than show it to you because it's an incredibly complicated slide, what I would broadly say is that when you're trying to find a fit between the product and the market, the best experience I can compare it to, it's a bit like my son has just chosen the subjects that he's going to study. Like, he'll do his NS in 2 years time, right? But he's got to finish off school before that. So he has to choose some subjects to study, and he's going to do the International Baccalaureate. So he has to figure out which subjects fit him. Right? And the way he's done that, I think, is by thinking about, well, which ones am I good at? Which ones do I enjoy? In other words, it wasn't an analytical process. It was more about trying on a series of things and exploring them. Generally speaking, I think trying to find product market fit is rather like that. There is quite a lot of research that suggests that the best way to analyze innovation, I talked about there not being a consistent process earlier on. There are some authors who would say that actually innovation is a complex adaptive system. There are those stakeholders I mentioned earlier, and they're all in a complex adaptive system configuration. So as anyone who's used to dealing with those kinds of situations knows, biologists are very good at this. They realize that you can't go in and kind of say X causes Y. You know that there is a sort of homeostatic balance in a system, and by poking the organism, by poking the jelly, you watch how it wobbles, and then you can kind of try and figure out which way to go next. Physicists, like I was trained to be, tend to say, no, we're not being rigorous enough here. We need to break this down into little components and rigorously test each component. And then when we assemble them together again, ta-da, we will have a thing that works, right? And of course, that doesn't work for large systems. You end up with all sorts of chaotic behavior. And it certainly doesn't work in biological systems. And my experience is it doesn't work in innovation either. So the only approach is a kind of, you need to probe the system by putting in things to see if they work. Do you remember earlier on I talked about having one of the ways to start building credibility with an audience, in particular with a technical audience? If you're selling something deeply technical people are not going to be the only people involved in buying your product or service, but they are going to be a gatekeeper. And as I mentioned earlier, technical people like to think they ask good questions and they're being perceptive, right? That's what they're paid to do, they think. So if you create a community online where people can kind of ask questions about your product or your technology, and you don't make it a salesy kind of thing, you make it a kind of very open thing where people discuss practical stuff, and you sponsor some get-togethers and you invite along people who are specialists in your technical area, and you give them some free booze. That helps a lot. which, by the way, is why we've got the big table at StartCentral. This would be an ideal location to run it in. Have chats where you informally chat with people. You're not selling anything. You're a bunch of experts all coming together to try and create the future, right? It's pre-commercial. This is all about the smartest people coming together to change the world, right? If you can help people feel that they're important in having a dialogue like that, then they will talk with you, and you can figure out from what they talk about and what questions they ask, what's important to you. And the instinct, you may have an instinct, if you were a graduate student in your university, you probably remember kind of your first seminar where you stood up in front of a bunch of professors, and the professors all tried to crap on you to prove in front of their colleagues how smart they were, right? That's quite a common experience. You're not at a sort of seminar, an academic seminar, where people are trying to cut down your ideas. You don't have to have all the answers. What helps, I think, in trying to find product market fit is actually fostering a discussion and being seen as someone who's technically informed, but wow, that's a really good point. I need to think about that. Even if you know the answer immediately, give them face by saying you need to think about it, and then follow up with an email later or post something to the group. Yeah. Don't just kind of like, well, yeah, you're absolutely right. And I've got this graphic. Right. You don't need to panic. You're not a graduate student in Aviva, right? It's not like that. So if that makes sense. We have a question here.
We have a few more questions.
Which one do you want to start with?
Maybe I can start with the question from Wei Wei Lo. So he's asking for the why when presenting a technology, is it typically on the problem that they want to solve and the gap, or anything else?
Yeah, it's often, so the why, of course, depends on whether you're an end customer or a user or a distributor. So for example, imagine you were trying to get a new diagnostic test for pregnant women for neural defects accepted, right? Clearly it's got to pass, it's got to be provide a benefit to regulatory people. It's got to be a lower risk, lower cost thing that the Ministry of Health can adapt and then deploy for all pregnant women. But if it involves a horribly painful, dangerous procedure that might put your fetus at risk or something, then the uptake by pregnant women is going to be quite low. If it's super expensive, insurance companies aren't going to want to cover it. So you'd have to make a story there about why doing this test. Yes, it is expensive, but actually it's going to save 55,000, $1 million treatments every year and reduce human suffering, and therefore it's a good investment, blah, 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 right? So the kind of the story that you'd need to present will need to be slightly different for each of those audiences, and the way you build up evidence around it would be different. I hope, does that answer the question? And do tell me if I'm not answering these questions, won't you, Juliana, here?
Yeah.
Thank you, Wei. Yeah, that did answer it. Good. And then
we have one more question from CC. So how do we pitch a good story to a multidisciplinary panel of people? So like with different backgrounds, chemists, biologists, clinicians, because each of them have a different idea. Yeah.
So the only way I find that works, because they're all trying to like measure it inside their heads. They're all thinking, I'm the doctor here. I need to make a clinical point. This is a clinical matter, right? And the kind of chemist is going to be going, well, that's fine from a medical point of view, but I can't, that thing just isn't possible. Chemistry doesn't make that possible, right? So that whenever I pitch something like that, instead of doing anything like selling to them, it's much better to have a dialogue to say, we've got this interesting, new technology. We're exploring how it might provide benefits. We really, really value your advice. Most experts love giving advice. And there were a couple of things I learned when I was a journalist working in TV, making TV programs. The first was that if you ask people, please, will you give me advice? The 8 out of 10 people will say yes. If you say, I'm researching a book and I'd really value advice, 9 out of 10 people will say yes. If you say to people, I'm trying to identify someone who can help me answer this question, right? So if I ask Juliana that, and she says, oh, you should talk to my friend Wei Wei. Now I can phone up Wei Wei and I can say, hey, Wei Wei, your friend Juliana said that you could help me with this. And then Wei Wei's going like, whoop, I've just been arrowed, right? Okay, I have to answer the question now, because otherwise I'm letting down my friend Juliana. So one of the interesting things about asking for advice or with sensitive people like that is, if you say to them, we're facing some, we think there's real opportunities with this technology, but there are some challenges that we're facing. Do you know anyone that we could talk to about this? What would be your approach? So you give them face by asking for their advice. Then the questions they ask will reveal to you, do they actually know anything about this topic? Are they aware of the competition? Do they know anything about their, how coherent is this group of people? Are they aligned on their interests, or are they going in every different direction? So by asking questions and appearing quite humble, you can actually pull out stuff from them. And again, it's that thing about thinking, going into the meeting thinking, we're all in this together as a partnership to make the world a better place. And I really respect you guys, because you should respect them. You might not be a medical doctor, you might be a PhD in chemistry, and you need a clinician on board. So respect the doctor and ask their advice. But also have your bullshit filters up, right? Think about, filters on stun, whatever, or phasers at 70%, because half the time there's going to be internal politics between those people, particularly in a large organization. And you need to be careful not to tread on buried landmines, right? So you just have to sort of, and this is something any business development person knows, you have to kind of go into the room and like feel your way and watch the body language, because sometimes you'll find people on the other side of the table who just hate each other. And if one of them likes your idea, then the other one's going to shoot it down. And it's got nothing to do with your idea. It's just they hate each other and they want to prove a point. So you have to be aware of those kinds of interpersonal dynamics too. I hope that's helpful. Yeah. And then there's a question about Johnson & Johnson. What's the best way of telling a compelling story if you want to get their support on a data-driven, personalized longevity app? Right. So if you were thinking, so I guess the thing to do would be to think, well, what's Johnson & Johnson said in public about what their ambitions are? There will be announcements that they will have made to their stakeholders. So there will be announcements in their last annual report to shareholders that we believe that alongside Johnson & Johnson's existing physical talcum powders and nutrient foods and blah, 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 we think that the digital domain is incredibly important. And actually health span is also a really important theme for us, right? So to get through the door, it helps, I think, first of all, to identify the right kind of person at the right sort of level, and to try and figure out what's that person trying to achieve. Now, the problem, if you've never worked in a large organization, you might not be aware of how frustrating it is to work in, not just Johnson & Johnson, I'm not knocking them, they're a great company, but any large organization, you might have an impressive sounding title and you might have a corner office, but you still have absolutely zero authority. You have to get buy-in from so many people in order to do anything, right? Whether it's organizing an office party or certainly adopting a new product or forming a new partnership. You've got this tension. You have to influence people inside the organization. Now, some people inside those large organizations are just kind of sitting there getting paid every month. They're just there doing their job, right? Some people actually want to make a difference. Some of them are frustrated entrepreneurs and will be really, really interested to talk to you because you're actually doing something, wow, you're doing a startup. Gosh, I can go back and tell my daughter today that I met a real startup person and she's doing this amazing startup. Wow, isn't that great? So if you can find someone who's first of all interested in innovation, and not everyone is. Secondly, someone who's well connected internally, to try and figure out to them and just ask them and say, I really recognize how complicated it is to try and get projects off the ground in any respected company like Johnson & Johnson. What would be the best way to start a dialogue with your internal stakeholders and to figure out whether this is something that might help J&J? Now, they might be really, really structured, and I might say, well, actually, we have a call for innovation every quarter, and here's a form you have to fill in and blah, 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 right? That's fairly unlikely. What's more likely is that they'll say, well, actually, the thing you're doing sounds really interesting. Like my boss was going on about this last week. So can you send me a slide deck? So if you send them a few slides, not many, right, but something that looks credible and leaves lots of questions open, a bit like that Algesis deck I showed you a clip from earlier on, that sort of shows that you're providing the things they're trying to do, even if it doesn't say exactly how, then they're going to be intrigued and then they're going to ask you in for a meeting. And you can start a dialogue that way. And do you remember that curve I showed about selling into a partnership with a business? The very first thing is figuring out what problem are they actually trying to solve internally. Now, you might think, oh, Johnson & Johnson should be interested in distributing this new anti-dengue vaccine that I've invented, right? Because dengue is really important and it's a massive issue in many parts of the world. Actually, the problem they're really trying to solve is they need to look good for the shareholders in front of the shareholders to show that they're doing something which isn't necessarily terribly profitable, but which is, good for the world, right? And ticks a box. And that really you're the kind of token community service technology. I mean, I'm being very cynical here, but there are all sorts of complex reasons inside a business that's as large as Johnson & Johnson for why it might be hard to find the right person. If I give you another example, because I think it's a fantastic question. I worked for about 4 years with Bosch, and they're very comfortable with me to speak openly about them. So I'm going to do that with discretion here. Bosch is something, I forget how many, it's something like 200, 300 operating companies, right? And nobody at Bosch understands what all of those operating companies do, right? There is no one person with a complete master overview, right? You can't, because they're all working in different territories with different kinds of products in different markets. So if you approach Bosch Southeast Asia with a product that you think might be good for them, the very first thing is thinking, well, where might this fit in? Which piece of the jigsaw might this connect to? Now, if they've been forward enough to actually articulate, we have a need, like it's an open innovation program that they're running, then that helps a lot. And the question I think you'd have to ask yourself there is, if I respond to their call for an open innovation program and disclose to them all my technology and everything else, is the confidentiality of it going to be respected? Are they just going to rip it off? If I sell to them and they get really enthusiastic and they want to invest in my business, then actually, is that going to put every other competitor off? Like if J&J is a customer of mine, that's really cool because now I've got legitimacy. But if J&J is an investor in my business as well as a customer, does that mean that, Novartis are not going to invest or something, So it can be a complex discussion. Sorry not to be able to give a clear answer there, but on something like longevity apps, I think the thing that you probably need to show is not just that this is efficacious, that this actually makes some difference on health span. And my own view is you might have a different view. I've looked at longevity quite a lot, and I used to run an oncology clinic for 9 months, and the advice that the doctors seemed to give everybody was eat properly, exercise, sleep properly, and go and do stress relief meditation. And only when you've done all of those things, then think about, apps and popping supplements and stuff like that. Now, if you've got some other science that shows that actually there is something different, then go for it. So I think from Johnson & Johnson's point of view, they'd want to know, if we adopted this app, what does that mean for our brand? What does that mean for our internal structures? What does that mean? And all of those questions you can't assess on your own from the outside. So the only way to assess it is through a dialogue. You might ask them to sponsor a session on longevity. You might say, hey, we're one of several tech companies developing longevity tech. We would like to have an event. We'd love it if J&J was willing to sponsor it as a kind of information sharing thing. And we're going to invite along 3 of our competitors. Okay. J&J might love that. And then you can go to Anthony at A-Star and say, and please could we host it at StartCentral? And he would say, yes, definitely. Wouldn't you, Anthony?
I think he's not at his
He's
desk
asleep. He's not at his desk. He's not even here. He's just got his, there you are. Yeah. It's very light. It's been an hour and a half now. You've been incredibly patient. I don't know how many people are still with us. We've still got 80, my goodness. Thank you for sticking with it. Anybody else that's got a burning question? Then I would just sort of say, thank you. I'm glad that was helpful. And please keep going. It is tough to tell stories that fit with everybody. It's very tough to have those stories make impact. But we're here to help and would love to see you succeed. So thank you for organizing this, Juliana. And thank you, Anthony and Juliana, everyone at StartCentral for making me so welcome for a long time now as a member of your community. I really enjoy being amongst fellow geeks.
Thank you for sharing. I think a lot of our attendees here have gained from your insights. If any of you have any questions, I think we occasionally see Hugh over at StartCentral. If not, you can always write into me and then I can link you up with Hugh for.
Or we can get together. Yeah, just organize a get together. Yeah. That's why we have whiskey. So. Okay, well, I'll say goodbye at this point then. And thank you very much once again, Juliana, for organizing everything. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thank you, Hugh. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.